Okay, so now I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm Berit Dinsdale. If I can get this out. There we go. Good start. Thank you again so much to everyone. I just kind of want to use my moment in the sun to also just say thank you to everyone that presented. This is such a fun conference. I'm actually not really involved in ethnobiology anymore, but I love it so much that I found a way to make it to this conference so I could watch all your talks. Super glad I did. So thank you. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about agrobiodiversity in cannabis and looking at cannabis cultivator preferences in the states of Colorado and Oregon. I'm actually really lucky that I've gone after some of our presenters because they've already given you some background on some of the terms I'm going to be using today. So without further ado, a little bit about the journey. I'll give you a short background on cannabis itself. I'll talk a little bit about some preliminary research that I did that kind of led me to this project. Give a little bit of background on ABD and cannabis biodiversity, and then I'll talk a little bit about the project itself that I did. I just want to specify that this was a smaller part of a much larger dissertation, and part of why I'm sharing things like the methods today and kind of what I found is I would really love to see this research get expanded. Maybe not by me, but maybe by one of you. That would be awesome. So to give a little bit of background, cannabis is the genus of the plant I'm going to be speaking about today. And as Dr. Merlin actually alluded to, we're really in the beginnings of our cannabis knowledge journey. And when I say that, we really actually are still debating how many species of cannabis there are. Most of us are familiar with cannabis sativa. We also are familiar with the name indica. There is actually a third called cannabis ruderalis that grows in harsher climates, and it is an auto-flowering variety, which is very different than indica and sativa. And that is actually being used right now, especially by outdoor growers to try to breed for auto-flowering varieties because it's much easier to produce them. It is an annual, it's mostly dioecious, so male and female plants. And again, as you've heard in previous talks, the female plant is the economically desired plant. It produces those really beautiful flower buds that are then smoked or processed for their secondary metabolites, the cannabinoids and the terpenes. And the two most common ways that is propagated are through cloning, so taking a cutting from a mother plant, and also through the feminization of seeds by the application of colloidal silver. Please don't ask me how that works. I don't know. Someone in the audience probably does, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. But cloning is definitely the most popular form of propagation. And again, just to go back to the taxonomic debate, because if we're talking about biodiversity in cannabis, that's kind of important. Indica and sativa, you've probably heard indica, couch, right? And those are the effects. It's more of a sedative. Sativa was always considered a little bit more uplifting. As time has gone on and there's been so much crossbreeding and interbreeding, those terms have really not come to mean anything anymore. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind as consumers and as researchers. So there is quite a bit of debate right now about how do we decide about cannabis species? Is it a morphological thing? Is it about tall plants, short plants, narrow leaves, broad leaves? Is it about the effects, chemometric? So these are just ongoing debates. The distinction that was important for my research, though, is that I am looking at drug type varieties of cannabis versus hemp. Drug varieties have greater than 0.3% of the cannabinoid delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, more commonly known as THC. Less than that cutoff is considered a hemp-based variety. So to give you some background on how this project started, I was actually managing a grow, an extraction facility and a dispensary from 2017 to 2018. And I made an observation while I was there that there seemed to be a highly gendered division of labor in the industry. So women were mostly working in the, surprise, surprise, more unskilled, lower paid jobs, but there were a lot of men working in kind of the more prestigious positions doing things like selecting strains to grow, working on the extraction, and making a lot of the choices about what was happening in terms of cultivation. There was also a really heavy emphasis that I was observing on increasing delta-9 THC content. So does anyone know what this is in the bottom picture? So that is called a baller jar, because if you have one, you're a baller. And essentially how this is made is that those crystals are actually pure THC. So what's done is that they actually take the fresh frozen plant and immediately extract it, and you get those crystals, which are THC crystals. That nice amber like liquid around it is actually the terpenes. But these were becoming increasingly popular, not just in the markets, but also amongst industry participants as well. So those two kind of observations seem like they might not be very interconnected, but my background is actually in agricultural studies. And I started thinking a little bit about agrobiodiversity and this idea that when we take a look at ABD, we're really looking at kind of thousands of years of kind of environmental changes showing up in this kind of genetic pattern, but we're also looking at the history and legacy of human intervention with that plant. People have actively been making selections and choices about environment and phenotypes and traits that have resulted in this kind of genetic profile or buffet, if you will. So what I'm really interested in more generally is really operationalizing the concept of culture within agricultural biodiversity. And of course, most of you are familiar with this, but culture is really constituted by different norms, knowledge, skills, preferences, things of that nature. I'm also especially interested in things like intercultural variation. So in particular in things like participatory plant breeding. There is a lot of literature that does show us that there are variations by things like gender, race, and ethnicity when it comes to things like making selections in breeding programs, what types of phenotypes are important, what kind of preferences, what attributes are you looking for in a plant. So I also did some cursory research into cannabis biodiversity and asked, was this just something anecdotal that I was noticing, but wasn't actually happening? And it turns out that a lot of the folks that were working in this field were noticing the same thing, is that there really is a distinct genetic sameness to cannabis. I always like to point out to people, a lot of folks don't know this, but there's actually not any sort of naming conventions in cannabis industries. You can really call things whatever you'd like to call them. And that kind of can give the appearance that there is this wide variety of strains available. But that is kind of a bit of an illusion. There was also an emphasis on THC production. So I always think that this is fascinating, but in 1995, average THC content was about 4%. Then it was 12% in 2014, and then it was 18%. And I will tell you from working in the industry, 18% was actually considered kind of low. So if you've ever smoked cannabis and had kind of an out-of-body experience, this is probably why. I also had a lot of older folks who would say, when I was younger, like I could get loaded, tiny little bit and it was fine. And now if I smoke weed, like I'm out for days. This is part of the problem. And so why was this happening? There weren't too many people working on this at the time I did my project, but there were a few, one whose name you might remember because he was literally standing here about 20 minutes ago. So Mark Merlin, totally fine that I'm giving this presentation after him, not nervous at all. But he was suggesting that it was indeed due to grower and breeder preferences and practices. Okay, so very quickly to move through this. So my objective became to look at talking to cannabis growers, right? So asking them, what are your preferences? What are you looking for in breeding facilities? Excuse me. I also had the sub-objective of disaggregating the data and looking at whether or not there were differences amongst gender, race, age, et cetera, when making those choices. I'm sure this is not going to feel familiar to anybody, but it turns out dissertations take a really long time, and I had to be a little bit less ambitious ultimately. Again, I bring that up because I would love to see someone do this. Maybe not me, but maybe one of you, and I would love to support you in that. So how did I do this? I have a qualitative background. I did use mixed methods in this study, but this portion was mostly qualitative. So I actually just sat down with people before we started our interview. I said, tell me what you're selecting for. What's important to you, right? So list it, any order that you want, have at it. Then I would use the interviews to ask them to clarify the selections that they had made and just make sure that I was clear on why they were making the choices that they made. So this is a really just brief overview of the demographics. And I always like to point out, in part because I'm making excuses for myself, but it's also true. I only ended up with about 21 participants. So it's also why I felt uncomfortable disaggregating the data. But for those of you that are not familiar working in this industry, it's really hard to get people to talk to you sometimes. They're not super fond of working with government or institutions. They're also literally located in places that are locked down like Guantanamo. Like you can't just walk into a grow and be like, hey, you want to help me with my research? So I was actually quite pleased with the 21, but it would be lovely to see this done with a much larger population size. So for those of you not familiar with free listing, this is a process where you essentially look at the frequency of mention of an attribute, and you also look at where it's ranked. I was not calculating this by hand, but it's called Smith's S formula. And it essentially, again, looks at that frequency, looks at that rank, and then provides a salient score. The closer that it is to 1, the more salient it is. I used a natural breaking point of about 10%. So if it was over frequency of 10, I decided to keep it. This question of to group or not to group, I wanted to share this with you because I think it's really important that we be super transparent in how we're choosing to process and analyze data that can really change the outcomes. So one of the questions I had to deal with were if someone's talking about things like smell or things like taste or things like effect, all of those could actually be secondary metabolite attributes, but if they're not listing them as terpene related, the question was, do I keep them separate or group them together? And that actually did have a big impact on the actual outcomes. So these were the results that I found. So after talking to producers, there were 52 unique items, 19 had a frequency greater than 10%. The categories I ended up splitting them into were kind of commonly horticultural results, phenology, which is things like flowering time, chemometric profiles, and economic. So the ungrouped results showed that actually yield had the highest salient score. That was the most important to the largest number of growers that I spoke to, but it was followed pretty closely by high THC content. I did, again, going back to that grouping or ungrouping and why that's important. If I grouped together terpene-related attributes, that by far became the most salient, right? And that completely kind of invalidates the original hypothesis. So again, just being really considerate about how we're processing data is super important when we're looking at these kinds of questions. So talking a little bit more about the results in depth, again, there was general agreement on yield, and the reason for that being that this is a commercial industry, right? You have to produce a certain amount of product to get a return on your investment. And there was an impetus to increase THC content. But what was different about this is that it wasn't necessarily for the reasons I thought it was, which is like, guys are like, yeah, I'm going to get like super high, produce 30% THC weed, man. People did say that that was happening in the industry, but there was always a tendency to say that other people were doing that and not them. So they're like, totally, yes, that's happening. Definitely not me, but everyone else, they're doing that. So there's a little more investigation that needs to happen there. But one of the more interesting results I thought was that a lot of this had to do with testing regulations. So in most states, you only need to put THC and CBD content on the packaging. What that does essentially, though, is that kind of signals to the consumer that those are the most important components of the product that you're buying. And a lot of people tend to look at the higher number, the higher number and think they're getting a better bang for their buck. And so they were starting to use that as a metric to buy cannabis products. So that was an unintended side consequence of that. Thank you so much. Oh, yes. That was life-giving. Okay. So terpene-related frequencies, I just wanted to mention this because I don't want to be a reductionist. There's a lot of growers that are really talented and that are thinking about a lot of different things when it comes to cannabis breeding. So for example, terpene-related knowledge, there was a lot of discussion about intuition and the association between smell and maybe what your endocannabinoid system needs. So a lot of people mentioned, you know, the nose knows. That's what my mentor told me a long time ago. That's what I tell them when I'm showing people weed, essentially saying, don't look at the numbers, you know, what smells good to you, what's calling to you. So there is still that kind of more ephemeral component to cannabis breeding. There was also a lack of terpene-specific knowledge amongst breeders, though. So even the folks that were saying we need to be paying attention to terpenes, it's really important. No one really was talking about why. So no one was saying, oh yeah, myrcene is really important because it bridges the blood-brain barrier. They were just like, yeah, sometimes we breed for myrcene, sometimes we breed for limonene. So that was indicative to me that people are starting to understand the value of terpenes, but it's still not entirely clear what they all do or why they're important. So why is this important in my mind? So essentially, we do know that cultivators are actively seeking to increase THC content. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. Some of them are internal to cannabis culture, but some of them are also external. And I think that state institutions need to take a look at what they're actually advocating for, what they focus so heavily on CBD and THC specifically. And why does this matter? The most concerning thing for me is that there are 150 terpenes and over 100 cannabinoids. And so if we're breeding out some of these attributes and secondary metabolites, what kind of consequences is it going to have for treatments and negative health outcomes in the future? So I think it's really important we address that. Super quick last point. Again, future research, I would love to disaggregate this kind of data by outdoor and indoor cultivation. I think that that's going to yield some really interesting results. And again, I would love if someone wanted to take this forward and do this kind of biodiversity preferences by these attributes. I'd be happy to help support anyone who's interested in doing that. So anyways, to finish, because I'm going over, that's me with Tommy Chong. Thank you for your attention, and all questions and comments are welcome.